Hello, everybody. I'm going to introduce you to the brown trout, and of which I'm assessing the freshwater growth stage using scale growth analysis. I'm, as already introduced, Katharina Stroh, and I have been supervised by Dr. Deirdre Brophy from the GMIT in Ireland. The brown trout, a Salmo trutta, is a salmonid, and characteristically for salmonids, they would spend the first part of their life in freshwater, and then they would either decide to migrate to the sea, to the ocean, which would be called anadromy, and I will refer to sea trout as this form of behavior. And then another part of the population might actually stay in freshwater, which is called residency. I'm going to refer to those trout as brown trout. And the drivers of anadromy or partial anadromy are not quite understood yet, but in most cases, it seems to be size dependency, environmental parameters, food availability, density dependency, body condition, growth, and epigenetic effects, and of course the interaction between all those factors. And both forms can actually originate from one population, as it is the case with the Burrashul catchment in northwestern Ireland. And what is quite advantageous to this site is that it has two fish trapping facilities, which are monitoring eel and salmonid movement between Loch Fia and downstream to Loch Furnace and back upstream. And due to this, the catchment is actually of national and international importance for salmonid monitoring and provides data to ICES to assess the status of salmonids in Ireland and in the wider North Atlantic. And also, as a part of this monitoring program, actually a repository of samples of otolith and fish scale samples has been collected, which covers several decades. And I used some of those samples from this repository. Another advantageous thing is that it samples environmental data from both Loch Furnace and both Loch Fia and Loch Furnace since the late 60s, which also enables me to use environmental data in my thesis. So the prime problem is that the anadromous form of trout has been declining since 1975, and temperature could be linked to this decline. So what is happening then if with warming climate temperature, with warm water temperature, temperate fish such as the trout are highly threatened to decline and collapse due to their early life spent in freshwater and the limited mobility to better feeding grounds or better living grounds due to the fact that lakes tend to be enclosed systems. Which brings me to my research question. The first research question would be if there is a difference between brown trout and sea trout growth from Burrashul. And my second research question would be, does brown trout, so only the resident trout, growth change over time, and which environmental parameters include the change, influence the change in this growth parameters? To solve those questions, I conducted a scale growth analysis. As I already mentioned, I used scales from the repository, and I sampled, prepared, and photographed them under the microscope, and the result you can see here. And then I extracted several growth parameters from the scale. First of all, we have circuli width, which is the white spacing between those dark growth rings, which are the circuli. And then I summed the circular width and got radius. And as you can see, radius is in a linear relationship with fish length. So it has been used in multiple studies as a proxy for fork length and fish length, which I did as well. And circuli, however, as you can see in the study on marine growth in Atlantic salmon, is in a relationship with length increments per day. So what you can see here is the circuli formation rate per day, and it's in a positive linear relationship with length increment per day. So there is an increase in size over a certain amount of time, which qualifies it as a proxy for growth rate. I analyzed my data using generalized linear mixed models and linear mixed models. As you can see here, my response variables, as mentioned before, counts and width and radius. And then the set of predictors changed slightly between research questions. I would have the first research question, which is focusing on species. So I included age to account for age-dependent effects, which is important in relatively short-lived fish, such as trout. Then I included the species group to detect differences between brown trout and sea trout. And then I also included the year at birth as a random intercept to account for temporal differences. Because overall, I got a timeline from the 1980s to 2018. And I calculate the year at birth by subtracting the measured age of fish from the year of capture, which is giving me a timeline from the late 70s to 2018. In the second research question, I slightly changed the set of predictors. I kept age and year at birth, but I replaced species by summer and winter temperature to account for an environmental effect when I look at change over time. To answer my first research question, so as you can see, there is a clear difference between brown trout and sea trout in the first year of growth. As you can see in red, the first year of growth, and in green, the second year of growth. And there was a small but significant difference between both species. So what you can see here is that sea trout actually grow faster and bigger than brown trout. In the third year ever, there is an inversion, and brown trout seem to grow faster and bigger than sea trout. And what we can see here is actually that brown trout elevate their growth to prepare for migration, because when they migrate to sea, they have to prepare for much more dangerous grounds and waters. For example, higher predation risks, and size actually ensures better chances for survival and fitness. This, however, indicates slower growth. So what we can see here is that might be due to sampling, which is occurring at a certain month in the year. It's possible that the sampling took place at a later stage in the year, where the migration period has already passed or is at its very end. So only slower growing individuals would have been sampled here instead of higher growing individuals, which have been up here. Then we look at age-related differences, and you can see that older individuals actually have slower first and second year growth, and which again shows us that there were species with a higher rate of slow-growing individuals. And then we can also see that some fish already prepared for migration, as you can see with 2-year-olds already exhibiting signs of increased growth rate and length, as well as fish who are already commencing migration in the third growth year. Then to answer the second research question, where we focused only on brown trout in the first growth year, we could see that there was no temperature or age effect, but there was a temporal effect, and some patterns emerged over the temporal timeline, as you can see here, which shows some kind of wavy pattern of increase and decrease in the late 70s and early 80s, with one exceptionally good year of growth in 1989, as well as another wavy pattern in the early 2010s. And on brown trout growth, on trout growth in general, several parameters are having an effect, which is of course, for example, food availability, density dependence, and environmental shifts. And what could be contributing to the exceptionally good growth in 1989 is that there was a high rate of mortality among sea trout, which would have returned to the lake. So what could have happened is that due to less trout coming back to the resident trout, there would be more resources and space in terms of, food and space left for the resident trout to feed upon, which would result in better growth. Then when we look at the second growth year, we see that there was a slight effect of age, and a better effect of temperature. And what is actually visible here is that overall growth remains the same, but the age of capture affects the likelihood of catching faster and slower growers. So if we would catch fish at age 1, we would have ultimately a higher rate of faster growing individuals. While if we would catch fish at age 3, we would have a higher occurrence of slower growing individuals. In terms of temperature, summer temperature has been insignificant, but we can see winter temperature being significant, which is going against standing hypothesis that with warmer temperature, growth rate would increase due to metabolic rate. And what is likely to see here over the course of time and over the course of temperature is that probably at the start of winter, feeding resources have been bigger, have been richer, and then over time have been depleted by either brown trout feeding as well as overall feeding. So resources have been depleted, leaving less chances to actually gain energy to grow. So the first research question could be answered, yes. There was a difference between growth in brown trout and sea trout Robora shoal. This has been from a lower significance rate, but it has been different. And what could have been a driving factor is the genetic similarity between brown trout and sea trout, since they're coming from the same population and interbreeding might occur. The second research question could only partially be answered, since there was a temporal effect on growth, but the environmental parameters have been somewhat inconclusive and would require further analysis, which I'm actually doing because I'm not quite finished with my thesis analysis yet. So in my second analysis on environmental parameters, I'm including more factors such as temperature certification to account for movement of fish between different water strata, pH value, chlorophyll A, dissolved organic matter, dissolved oxygen, and turbidity to account for a more complex lake system. And as well, I'm going to see how many circuli have actually been formed within a certain time frame using brown trout recaptures from 2019. In conclusion, we can see that there were differences in growth between species, which likely confirm existing literature. Then we can also see that age is negatively correlated with growth. So older individuals exhibit slower early growth, indicating there was a higher rate of slower growing individuals in Lake Via. And there was also a shift in importance of intrinsic and environmental parameters. So in early growth, there must be a much more complex setting of parameters mediating growth, while in the second year, age and temperature gain influence, but could not explain all of the data. So there are still more factors to explore, and which brings me to the overall implication of the status of my research so far, is that there are much more parameters than only temperature and age, which are mediating growth in brown trout. Thank you very much for your attention. I would like to thank my supervisor, Dr. Deirdre Brophy, my family and friends for their support, and thank you very much. I'm happy to take on your questions now.